The United States is weighing up options as North Korea steps up its weapons testing. But why has the US strategy failed with Pyongyang so far? Is it lack of pressure or lack of engagement? This is Inside Story. Hello there, welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Well, this week, North Korea conducted an underground nuclear explosion. It's second since 2006 and a direct violation of a United Nations Security Council resolution. It then test-fired several short-range missiles and announced it would respond militarily if international forces attempted to intercept its ships. This last came after South Korea joined a naval force that stops and inspects vessels suspected of carrying banned weapons. It's part of a US-led program called the Proliferation Security Initiative to blockade any nation suspected of trading nuclear materials. In response, North Korea has said it is no longer bound by the 1953 truce, which ended the war with the South. That's heightened tensions on the peninsula, leading US and South Korean troops to raise their alert level. President Barack Obama has strongly condemned Pyongyang's actions and called for a strong international response.
North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs pose a grave threat to the peace and security of the world, and I strongly condemn their reckless action. North Korea's actions endanger the people of Northeast Asia. They are a blatant violation of international law, and they contradict North Korea's own prior commitments. Now, the United States and the international community must take action in response. The record's clear. North Korea has previously committed to abandoning its nuclear program. Instead of following through on that commitment, it has chosen to ignore that commitment. Its actions have also flown in the face of United Nations resolutions. As a result, North Korea is not only deepening its own isolation, it's also inviting stronger international pressure.
So, what to do next? Joining us today are our guests in Washington, D.C. Richard Weitz, Director of the Center for Political and Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Also in Washington, D.C., Scott Snyder, Director of the Center for U.S.-Korea Relations at the Asia Foundation. And in London, Dan Plesch, Director of the Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy. Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed for joining me. Scott, let me start with you. Is one able to sum up just how dangerous and tense this situation is now?
Well, clearly we're moving in the wrong direction in terms of a series of actions and reactions that continue to escalate tensions. Fortunately, we haven't seen actual military conflict yet, but certainly that is part of what the North Koreans appear to be possibly threatening in the context of their statement that they're no longer bound by the armistice.
Richard, this is an extraordinary situation, isn't it? I mean, North Korea is one of the poorest countries on earth. It's got 23 million people. Most of them are on the brink of starvation. How can this nation wreak such havoc?
It's it's totally outrageous, the policies they're pursuing. I will grant you that, given the needs of their people. That aside, they've discovered one mechanism that really gets everybody's attention, and that's to seek nuclear weapons, to test a nuclear weapon, to threaten to use nuclear weapons, to threaten to other kinds of violence against people. That will gain a lot of attention throughout the international community.
Okay, so Dan, what are Obama's options? I mean, there he is. He's pretty new in office. He's talking about reaching out to countries like North Korea. What are his options now?
Well, I see you leave the easy question for me. I think we should rewind a little and cool down. I mean, this North Korean explosion, such as it is about as tiny a nuclear explosion as you can get, around about 2,000 tons of TNT, a fraction of Hiroshima. Their ballistic missiles don't work very well. And indeed, they're trying to get attention. Let
me just interrupt. Russia's defense ministry was saying that this explosion that they carried out.
If you look at this deal that was done with, if you look at this deal that was done with the Bush administration, one of the things that happened was that the Bush administration upped the ante and insisted on, from the North Korean perspective, on a further round of requirements. And then when the North Koreans didn't like this, it decided that there should be a halt to the fuel and other aid that was going to be given to the North Koreans. And I think a number of the North Korean actions stem from this, that from their perspective, and it's always a good idea in negotiations to look at the other side of the hill, from their perspective it's the international community that's reneging on its deals. And with respect to the armistice, let's just remember that I'm sure a part of the armistice agreement back 50 years ago was that there wouldn't be interference with each side's vessels. Now, under this Proliferation Security Initiative, which the South Koreans have now joined, the idea is to interfere with North Korean vessels. So from that perspective, they're just looking at things technically and saying, well, actually, it's the international community, the US, the UN, that is breaking these agreements. This is not my perspective, but I think one needs to understand where they're coming from here. And from that, I think there's plenty of room to negotiate. And I think it's a testament to the incompetence of the previous American administrations that this tin pot little dictatorship is still flaunting itself in this way.
Okay, let me put that to Richard Weiss in Washington, D.C. there. Dan's saying that the international community have failed their obligations towards North Korea. What do you make of that?
Well, he prefaced that. He said that's the North Korean perspective, and that may be accurate. But there appears to be something going on domestically within North Korea which we don't fully understand related to the succession process. The most plausible explanation I've heard is that the current leader, Kim Jong-il, wants to have one of his children succeed him, one of his sons. And to do that, he wants to ensure that he'll have support of the military. And he thinks the best way to do that is to rally people behind a strong defense. If you create a sense of external threat, that tends to strengthen your respect within the government. And so this appears related to what's going on domestically, because otherwise the timing's odd, because the new Obama administration, although its initial focus wasn't on Korea, it's certainly been a very top priority for them, and they were very eager at some point to try and engage Korea and move the action for action process further along. So why things fell apart all of a sudden with their missile test and now the atomic bomb or some kind of nuclear device test, it's just somewhat unclear. It doesn't really, you can't fully explain it from the external environment.
Scott, do you think that it was the case, as Obama said in that clip that we heard from him, that North Korea had committed to winding down, getting rid of its nuclear program? Do we know that that actually was the commitment? I mean, they did put Pyongyang out of action, but was it actually technically sealed as they said it would be?
Well, the commitment under the joint statement in the six-party talks was to denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. And North Korea signed on to that statement. So, and the actions that were taken in 2007 and 2008 with the Bush administration and under the six-party talks were implementing actions to fulfill that statement. It's true that the Bush administration and the DPRK came into conflict over the question about when verification should occur, but in light of that broad commitment to denuclearization, I think that it's implicit and even explicit in the joint statement that there would be a verification in some form.
Okay, let's take a look at some past history. Tension over North Korea's claims of nuclear proliferation has grown over the past decade. It threatened to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2003, but joined six-nation talks on the subject, along with China, Japan, Russia, the US and South Korea. Less than 2 years later, North Korea announced it had nuclear weapons. 18 months after that, it said it had carried out its first successful nuclear test. Just 5 days later, the United Nations imposed wide-ranging sanctions as a punishment for the tests. In 2007, North Korea agreed to shut down its Yongbyon nuclear reactor. But in April this year, Pyongyang announced its intention to leave the six-nation talks. Dan, do you think North Korea could be coaxed back to the table to take part in some form of six-party talks? Or do you agree, as some analysts say, that they are dead?
Oh no, and frankly, unless we think we want to go and have a war with North Korea, we better get our act together. As I say, because of the dispute over verification, the Bush administration, with Chris Hill having pursued a remarkably good diplomacy, then blew it all by having a suspension of the aid shipments to the Koreans. And that, as I say, along with the election of a president in South Korea who got rid of the sunshine policy his predecessors had and had a much more hardline policy with the North, that I think has played a very significant role in this. And I think it is a terrible state of the international news media that we're pursuing this White House generated view of the situation with the Koreans and not getting a more rounded analysis, which I think lets Washington off scot-free in all of this, and indeed the Japanese, who also suspended their shipments. The Russians regarded this as a unilateral American action and continued to meet their obligations to the North Koreans on this. This is not to say that I have at the moment sympathy with the North Korean regime or its missiles or its nuclear weapons, but we need to get a sense of when our negotiation is sensible and when it's been messed up. And I think if we get back onto track, if the Obama administration has direct talks, and if we can pursue a rapprochement with the South, that there's a very good prospect of ending this.
So what are you saying? Are you saying that North Korea should be now accepted as having nuclear weapons, and that the goal of the original six-party talks to get rid of nuclear weapons from North Korea, that should not be the starting point anymore? They certainly should not be accepted, but one should get back to the negotiating table, not exaggerate their proposals. I mean, the idea that the Koreans are an immediate direct threat to the whole world, as President Obama said, I think his speechwriter was getting a bit too hyperbolic about all of this. Yes, there is a theoretical possibility that they could at some point start selling nuclear weapons on the open market, and yes, this should be stopped, absolutely. But, you know, I don't think people too often in Washington actually look at the consequences. Getting this Proliferation Security Initiative going, I doubt that anybody beyond the working level in the Washington bureaucracy said, oh, gee, I think the Koreans will probably think that we've reached the armistice conditions if we do this. That would be too inconvenient a piece of analysis to make its way up the food chain to the White House and to Secretary Clinton. Well, what do you think about this?
The North Koreans have read it.
Scott, what do you think about this? Are we following White House hyperbole, as Dan suggests?
Okay. Well, I have a number of points to make. One, I don't think that the Proliferation Security Initiative would necessarily be a breach of the armistice conditions, because the Proliferation Security Initiative, as I understand it, is supposed to operate within the bounds of international maritime law. And so it may well be that the North Koreans have an exaggerated view of what is really possible under PSI. It is the Proliferation Security Initiative. It's not the North Korea Security Initiative. Secondly, it seems to me that the advice that Dan is giving is really directed to the DPRK, because it's the North Koreans that you know, haven't really responded to the opportunity, I think, to engage with an administration that, as a general principle, is open to engagement. You know, as one analyst, Ralph Casa, has said, we've asked for them to unclench their fist, and they've given us the finger. And so it seems to me that you know, in order for there to be a dialogue, the North Koreans do need to send a signal that they are open to it.
Richard, what do you make of that? Let me put that point to Richard, that the North Koreans have been given the opportunity to engage, and they simply haven't responded. And indeed, there is a line of thought that says North Korea isolating them, backing them to a corner, has clearly not worked.
Well, it's not. The problem is it's occurred very early in the Clinton administration. Sorry, the Obama administration. Secretary Clinton had only recently appointed a person to deal with the North Korean issue. So it wasn't the most important. It was an important issue. It wasn't something that the Obama administration, when they came in office, immediately started working on. They were trying to get their people in place, sort out their strategy. And so it's possible the North Koreans are just trying to get our attention again. They seem to be very unhappy whenever we forget about them, and we reassure them that they're an unforgettable regime, so they don't have to worry, but it doesn't always work. That aside, it's somewhat confusing. I mean, perhaps they've been receiving mixed messages from the international community. The Obama administration has said it wants to pursue outreach and so on, but they hadn't appointed a negotiator, hadn't sent somebody there. The Russians have been mentioned several times. They're somewhat confused as well about what's been happening. They've sent the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, went there to try and meet with the officials to sort it out, and even he came away a bit puzzled by what was happening. Again, it seems somewhat related to what's going on internally within the succession process within North Korea, as well as the international environment, because they could interpret the international environment in a broad range of ways because they're receiving a broad range of signals. And they've obviously, if they have perceived it very negatively, it might be related to what's going on internally.
OK, so where does the international community go from here? Some analysts say the world has just about run out of peaceful options in dealing with North Korea. China has urged it to return to six-party talks, but US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton acknowledged back in April that seemed implausible, if not impossible. So what's left? Well, in the wake of this week's nuclear test, the US Treasury is reportedly considering further financial sanctions by closing off its international bank dealings. It's done this in the past, but was forced to return $25 million in frozen funds when the dispute stalled the six-nation talks. The US could try to persuade China to cut its energy supplies to North Korea. China supplies 90% of North Korea's oil needs, but in the past it has resisted tougher economic sanctions because it didn't want the risk of a failed state on its borders. Perhaps the toughest weapon in the international arsenal is its enforcement of the Security Council resolution passed after the 2006 test, authorising the US and other nations to inspect ships going in and out of North Korea. But North Korea has already said it would view such inspections as an act of war. This is what former US ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, told Al Jazeera he wanted to see.
I would recommend economic sanctions along the lines of those imposed on Iraq after it invaded Kuwait in 1990. In other words, way beyond the military sanctions imposed on North Korea in 2006. I believe this is a case that calls for North Korea to be expelled from the United Nations for persistent violations of its charter. And just on the U.S. Account, I would return North Korea to the list of state sponsors of terrorism.
An unusually tough response from John Bolton there. Dan, what do you think about John Bolton's hardline response?
I think John's wimping out here. The problem with these hardliners is they're not very hardline at all. If he meant it, the Bush administration should have gone to war with Korea to enforce its policies. They had 8 years. They almost pulled off a very good deal, and then, as I said, they blew it. The critical thing that needs to happen now, going back to your talk about options, is that the Obama administration needs to restart the aid under the six-party talk deal, except that the North Koreans have been getting mixed messages because of that and because of the great change in policy in Seoul with the new president that I'm sure the North Koreans regard as an American puppet. And to accept, yes, indeed, as with any dictatorship, there is a great deal of infighting going on, as ever. We forget, that in the infamous original axis of evil, there was a huge amount of infighting within Mussolini and Hitler's governments, and I'm sure there is going on in North Korea right now. And the question is whether or not we are able to say to those people who favour the negotiations, actually, this is reasonably being honoured. We also need to understand that from the North Korean perspective, again, this is not because I support the North Koreans, but all too little in our analysis do we get their perspective, is that the war that had an armistice in '53 was a United Nations war. It was supported by the Security Council as one of those oddities of the Cold War period. So from the North Korean perspective, they have been and are still at war with the United Nations to a degree, even though they're represented in it. And that dichotomy, that complexity, is something we need to realize when we see the tension hotting up again over the interception of vessels, and I'm sure that the armistice provided that vessels wouldn't be interfered with, although I must say I have not checked the text.
Let's talk about China's position on this, because we know that China took an unusually strong response to this. Scott, do you think that the US will be able to persuade China to impose any kind of sanctions or take a tougher stand than it has done in the past?
I believe that China has already signaled by its actions related to the presidential statement condemning the missile tests last month that it will accept a possibly broader scope in terms of application of UN sanctions. At the same time, I think there's a real question about whether that is going to be effective in terms of dealing with the situation. And I'm expecting the Chinese to also insist that any UN resolution will point to a diplomatic path.
But why wouldn't it be more effective? I mean, if the North Koreans suddenly found their closest allies and their big trading partners coming down hard on it, would that not have a positive response?
Well, you know, one question is I think the Chinese might be willing to endorse a UN sanction, but I'm not sure yet whether they're willing to enforce a UN sanction. Also, the critical sanctions that would be likely to really have an impact on North Korea are actions that the Chinese government is more likely to want to take bilaterally and not necessarily under a UN framework.
Richard, what do you think? Not only just about China's role.
Well, I just want to reinforce what Scott just said. It's true, I think, with both China and Russia that they're very cross-pressured. They don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. They're particularly, not only are they very close to North Korea in terms of borders, but there's just a risk that if North Korea would openly develop nuclear weapons, then Japan, South Korea, perhaps Taiwan, you could see would want to acquire nuclear weapons, and all this would redound very negatively.
You think it might actually precipitate an arms race in the region?
I think it's unlikely, but I think they're probably fearful of that. But on the other hand, they're hesitant to try and impose sanctions, or as Scott pointed out, the problem is we've adopted a lot of sanctions, we just haven't actually implemented them in the UN. But if they were to start doing that, they can see a lot of potential problems if the North Korean government were to collapse. There would be a surge of refugees flooding up where they are. Potentially the American military could move up into the north for humanitarian reasons or to track down the loose nuclear material. That would eliminate a buffer zone between them. A lot of the South Korean and potential Japanese investment that's been flowing to China and to Russia would then have to be diverted to North Korea if it were to be a reunification. So they see a lot of negatives if it were to push back. So I think the key distinction I would get across to your viewers is the United States and Japan would be very comfortable with the change of regime in North Korea. I think for China and Russia, they want to change in the regime's behavior, but not the regime itself, not in any kind of forced way. They may want to see gradual mellowing and decline of the bellicose nature of the government, but I think they just think a change in government would be too dangerous, too risky for them.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid, because we have run out of time. But thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining us here on Inside Story. Richard Weitz and Scott Snyder in Washington, D.C., and Dan Plesh speaking to us live from London. Thank you. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Do email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But for the moment, from me, Shuli Ghosh. Bye-bye for now.